Welcome to Quora Anonymous. If this is your first time and you like the video, please like and subscribe. If you would like to read along, turn on closed captioning with the 3 dots in the upper right corner. Now, let's begin. Let's review Onisions' book, Stones to Abbigale. Surprisingly, a 30-year-old man who made an entire career out of mocking and exploiting vulnerable people has no understanding of another's pain other than to boost his own ego. That much is clear when all of his ex and current girlfriends were abused at one point, allowing Onisions the role of the savior. So this leads to the broken bird Abbigale, whose only role is to prove protagonist James's godhood. James, as Onisions reiterates ad nauseam, is a teenage Onisions who's somehow better. Granted, that's a very low standard. Onisions unintentionally proves that, by making James a judgmental creep who treats everyone other than Abbigale as useless creatures on autopilot and completely irrelevant to his sole purpose, getting Abbigale. He doesn't care if people around him were killed, if his family were happy, as long as he gets some from his girlfriend. He loves her, despite her lack of personality, and spends every single moment of the book thinking obsessively about her, which, coming from a writer who hasn't read a book in 14 years, ends up reading like drafting deep Tumblr posts. Surprisingly, Onisions realizes he can't mock her here, or maybe that's just his teenage savior complex preventing him from seeing Abbigale as the actual person who he based her on, nonetheless. Obviously, a man who cannot even use commas correctly in a sentence will not sell on merit. That might explain why the blurb is entirely Onisions insisting that it's Onisions writing an autobiography, and much of his focus is on how he feels about his/James's past, rather than actual events. With a novel, originality and skill determines its success and the author's fame. With autobiographies, Gregory Jackson is free to shamelessly promote it on every page he owns, and his fan base of 11 to 14-year-old girls whose entire knowledge of life is secondhand from Taylor Swift choruses will eat it up. However, that still doesn't excuse directly responding angrily to reviews, especially making up conversations between him and reviewers. See his Tumblr. Let's look at the actual book. I walked quickly down the hall towards my art class, which was awkwardly placed in a trailer outside my clearly poorly funded high school. That's 4 adverbs in one sentence. Walked quickly could be replaced with hurried, or any variation thereof. The rest of the sentence isn't directly related to what James is doing, so it should be either short or a separate sentence. You could literally set your watch to whenever one of Onisions' phrases pop up. Literally is just the tip of the iceberg. He addresses most everyone on a daily basis in a tone, and doing what he thinks is dorky. Onisions also does not split his paragraphs or sentences correctly. On my way to the class, a fight had already broken out between 2 jocks who, no doubt, both had controlling, iron-fisted fathers who brainwashed them into believing conflicts between men are best resolved with the bloodying of the fists. Most of the sentence is unnecessary and non-descriptive, with very little supporting evidence, which is kind of the point of a story. The sentence runs on from a very brief description to a trite attempt at stream of consciousness which Onisions does not manage well, and ends up making James look like a prick. Much like Onisions himself. He fails one cardinal rule of paragraphs in fiction: 1 paragraph for each character. If James talks, the teacher's response should be in a different paragraph. With an opening chapter already rife with errors and so bland, it's not inexcusable that many readers would stop reading. There are some terrible metaphors. He compares his mind to neon walls and visualizes his crush's face like a projector. In the hands of a competent writer, the metaphor of James's mind as a theater may work well. Instead, it is clunky and completely fails at the purpose of a metaphor. Metaphors should reveal something about the character's personality or theme, or simply set the atmosphere/allow the readers to visualize a certain scene. Also, they should not be pointing out something blindingly obvious, like that a plush toy bear doesn't give off the smell of real blood, which sounds almost like Onisions' vegan tracts. Onisions takes enough pages out of circa 2017 fiction to make Stones to Abbigale accumulate more biomass than the entire teenage population of the United States. The result is some kind of monstrosity where jocks who say "dude, I think John's done bro" are thrown together with the stereotypical developmentally delayed kid with disgusting behavior, the teacher who expresses absolutely no concern over said student, and a terrible guidance counselor. Sadly, this is a bit closer to the truth than the rest of Onisions' book. There's also James's best friend Davis, whose only purpose is to worship and cater to his whims, such as standing up to give James the window seat. The poor verb usage is compounded with the complete absence of personality of Davis. I amused myself by imagining a scaled down version of Davis already as Onisions' best friend. As for the plot, literally nothing happens. James has a dream where the girl he likes is screaming, so he emails a love letter to her, talking about how he alone can heal all of her scars. Exact same letter Onision wrote to a girl also named Abby in high school. She rightfully chews him out for unwarranted white knighting, then suddenly confides in him. There's a school shooting by Abby's abusive ex Seth after she breaks up with him, and she has no reaction to the deaths of 52 students other than physical contact with James' 52 students shot in the head. Just for perspective, the highest death toll of a school shooting by a single perpetrator is 32 students. Soon HUI Cho at Virginia Tech. Onision gets nearly everything wrong about school shootings. First of all, so many shootings and other things happen that there's no way the president would visit every school where a shooting occurs. Secondly, the symptoms of shock are wrong. Crying while escaping isn't a symptom. Finally, none of the characters are shown to react at all. Onision needs to read some books. Apparently his own book was the first he read in 14 years, explaining why so much of it seemed to come out of Tumblr posts, and also learn empathy and deflate his ego. The best book you will ever pick up. Definitely an hour well spent. I freaking loved this book. I loved how not once in the entire story does James mention what Abbigale looked like. Seriously. Not even once. All I know is that she has hair and eyes and 2 arms and 2 legs. Just like me. Davis is not creepy at all. He does not exist solely to tell James how great he is and how much he loves him. That's not creepy, that's love. We definitely do not learn about Davis in a setting other than the bus that James goes on every day. I also know that Davis has hair and eyes. Not sure about the arms and legs though. James is 17, and he likes Abbigale because she is pretty. He also magically gains superpowers when he needs to protect his girlfriend from mean people because she can't fend for herself. Basically, they are living in a strange world called Dreamwork and Shrek. I mean, James likes to stay by himself. He has a best friend named Davis, and we know that he is his best friend because Davis has no other personality except for kissing James's ass. James falls in love with a beautiful princess Abbigale, and together they defeat jocks and meaners who don't want them to be together. The jock, who will stay unnamed due to privacy reasons, wants to date Abbigale, but did it again. James got to her first. Woo. There are so many characters to keep straight. Oh yeah, there might have been a school shooting or something. Frankly, I don't remember, because it wasn't really interesting. James, our lovely protagonist of this book, is a 17-year-old junior in high school. He has some sort of god complex. He studies his classmates and hates everyone, except for Abbigale, a girl he is obsessed with, and his friend Davis, who worships him. This could because A has a judgmental jerk, or B has actually an alien sent here to study human teenagers and fall in love. If you read the book through this lens, it becomes more interesting. Abbigale, the love interest of the main character, is a typical damsel in distress. She has no real personality besides the trauma she has gone through. James has to constantly save her. He saves her from her ex, who shoots up their school, her father, who is an abusive alcoholic, a jock who grabs her ass, and the crazy school counselor who later decides to burn down the school for some reason. Besides all this, Abby never develops a personality. Abby doesn't really do anything besides cry and take showers at James' house. Then there is Davis, the weird kid that is supposed to be funny who says things like how can I turn that frown upside down? Poopy poop poop, that's a direct quote, I'm not kidding. Davis' hobbies include riding the school bus, cheering up James, organizing his Legos by color, and worshipping James. Then there is the school shooting. No one we know dies. Nor does it really further the plot. Sure, James saves a bee while shuffling through the school in his socks, but there is no real reason for it to happen. In fact, nothing in the plot changes the main characters in any way. It's just stuff that happens. Despite the hardship a bee and James go through, they don't really change at all. They witness a school shooting, a man committing suicide, and James' best friend getting hit by a car trying to save the man who committed suicide. Then their school burns down. A bee says this about the trauma she's endured. I feel like, at this point, most bad things that happen won't really hurt us unless we let them. So, everyone, if you experience horrible trauma like miscarriage, a school shooting, or witness your best friend getting hit by a car, don't let it hurt you, and you'll be fine. It reads like it was written by a banana, by a banana, by a banana. This is by far the worst book I have ever read. The protagonist James is a total psychopath, and hates everyone but a girl in his art class. I would describe their looks, but the author never ever describes how any of the characters look. A lot of life-changing things happen to them, but nobody ever changes. The dialogues are terribly written. The characters have no development or characteristics whatsoever, and it's hard to empathize with any of them. There is no red line through the story, just things happen, and awkward talking and everyone praising the protagonist and end. There is no moral, no good feeling the reader is left with, and I assure you that you will never think of the characters again. You will most likely have forgotten their names instantly anyways, or pick up the book for a second read. Even as a first novel, this is just horrible and shameful. Not even adequate as a debut. The characters are as shallow as the author's internet presence and as unrealistic as his alleged online following, which consists of 11 to 16-year-old kids who worship him with their medication in one hand and razor blade in the other. It figures the author would write about a self-inflated and misunderstood teenage boy who is meant to come off as wise for his years, and yet only comes off as a clear depiction of an egocentric legend in his own mind. I kept waiting for aliens to land next. I mean, I understand that action is required in a book. Things have to occur to move plot, but there is just so much going on here, it is totally unrealistic. If just one thing was chosen, such as the fire or one character helping another through a trying time or the school shooting, or the best friend dying before his eyes, sheesh, it might have been better. It seems that perhaps the author thought he could make up for the shallowness of his characters and his inability to write in an engaging way by piling one catastrophic event on top of another. Unfortunately, it didn't work. It's difficult to even care about the characters, and the events meant to move the plot forward don't even move it slightly to the side. As mentioned, one of the myriad of events that happen in the story, had it been done well, could have made an excellent book. Instead you get a book that has about everything that could happen to a teenager happening, and it's a challenge to care. This book will find an audience though. Onisions minions will eat it up. The 11 to 16-year-old set gripping their razor blades and wallowing in a mass of their own imaginary problems will clamor for their copy. And this brings me to the message it seems that Onision is attempting in his mentally crippled way to get across. If you experience trauma, you just have to let it go. As the leading poster child for therapy, he wants this age-old message to come off as profound when it really isn't. Even old school lessons can be presented to people in an inspiring way though, if the story is good, and this one wasn't. It's easy to say let it go, but Onision doesn't have the fortitude or wisdom to point out that, in order to let go of a thing, one must first pick it up. I recommend waiting for this one to come out at your public library. If you insist on reading it, that way you won't waste money, just time, and that, like everything, is a choice, right? Just return it on time. It isn't even worth the quarter you'll pay for the late charge. I actually read this entire book. Why did I read this book? I'm not going to get into a big detailed review or anything, maybe more of a rant, because I really don't want to relive this experience. But honestly, the entire time I was reading this book, I kept forgetting it was written by a grown man in his 30s. It reads exactly like fan fiction written by a middle schooler. Actually, scratch that. I was probably writing better Harry Potter fan fiction when I was 13. There is not a single likable character in this book. James is a self-absorbed asshole. Abby has the personality of a cardboard box. Jason and Chris were almost indistinguishable from each other. The teachers were all such incompetent assholes that it is completely unbelievable that these people would have jobs at all. I don't even want to get started on Davis honestly. All I can say is, my hatred for him reached the level of my disdain for Tiny in John Green and David Levithan's Will Grayson, which says a hell of a lot. He was the epitome of the so random ! 11 quote phase we all wish we could forget. Throughout the entire book I was convinced he was actually 5 years old, since, as far as I can remember, it was never stated how old he was. There is really no conflict in this book. Sure, there's drama, but most of it lasts less than one chapter, and is never mentioned again. You could argue that the shooting is mentioned throughout the book, but there are hardly any repercussions. No one we know dies. The students never seem to suffer any kind of emotional trauma after 52 students are killed. I also cannot get past how everything in this book revolves around James. Davis is unreasonably obsessed with him, and talks about nothing else. James is the only possible candidate for school president, even though he makes absolutely zero good choices. Davis' mother talks about James more than she does about her own son in his eulogy. And I don't even want to talk about how terrible of a person James actually is. He is not fazed in the slightest bit by such a staggering amount of classmates dying. He says himself that the only person he cares about in the world is Abby. Their relationship is more dangerous and unhealthy than Twilight and 50 Shades put together. Anyway, I've ranted enough. I'll leave you with some choice quotes from everyone's favorite undeveloped character, Davis. How can I turn that frown upside poopy poop poop? Hi ho silver lady mammy poppysicle. To start it off and simply, this book is trash. There is absolutely nothing good about this book. Like, at all. If I could rate it any lower, then I would. The characters have zero personality for starters, except for the protagonist James, who is judgmental, narcissistic and obsessive. He manipulates the girl he loves, Abby, and takes advantage of her weakened emotional state. For Pete's sake, he sent her a love letter that tells her that only he can heal her scars. Keep in mind, James sends Abby this letter a mere 2 days after he talks to her for the first time 2 days. Not to mention, Abby had just gotten out of an abusive relationship. Of course, this book is riddled with numerous grammar and spelling errors. You can tell that the author hadn't picked up a book in 14 years. A 30-year-old man does not know how to use a comma. They teach basic grammar in elementary school. An 8th grader knows how to use grammar better than this author. I use the term author very generously. The plot is also trash. The problems are introduced in the beginning of the chapter, and then immediately solved by either the end of the chapter or the beginning of the next. The plot is just so contrived. There's nothing salvageable about this book. In order for it to be at least a decent novel, it would have to be entirely reworked. It's overfilled with crappy metaphors, and reads more like a bad fanfiction, rather than an actual published book. It's so obvious that this book was self-published, because no publishing company in their right mind would publish this tripe. I read this in the sense that I listened to someone read through it. Oh lord. I'm going to try to talk about my interpretation of this book without being offensive. I'm also going to go ahead and say that this review will be rife with spoilers. Spoilers below. Many of them. Seriously. Lots of spoilers. Turn back now if you don't want to be spoiled. What stood out to me the most is that the emotions the main character experiences, specifically in response to traumatic events, are not accurate to what most people would experience under those circumstances. Someone who steps in their fellow students' blood would not feel absolutely nothing about going back to the school where those students were killed, nor would they feel as though everything was okay because there were some students who hadn't lost someone close to them. Someone who sees their friend get hit by a car would not immediately descend into an existential spiral of self-hatred. They might feel some degree of survivor's guilt, sure, but for him to watch his friend die and immediately think that, if they hadn't been friends, the friend would still be alive, no. Everyone responds to traumatic events in different ways, but a school shooting that kills 52 people leaves nobody at that school untouched. James' distaste for the general student body doesn't make him an exception to this. His life is put in immediate danger by virtue of being present on the campus during an active shooter situation. His life is put in even more immediate danger when he confronts the killer face to face. That kind of thing leaves marks. He might have nightmares about Seth in his bloody trench coat pointing a gun at him, or about having been too late to save a bee, or about the students he stepped over calling to him for help. He might become clingy or desperately afraid for a bee's safety. He might have a flashback or a panic attack upon walking through the halls again, once the school reopened. He would almost definitely require grief counseling, and the narrative could discuss his struggles with that. None of this happens, though. The shooting happens, everyone is sad, and spouts empty encouraging rhetoric for a day or two, and then they carry on as normal. And then the loss of his supposed best friend reads like, well, not like that at all. Onisions skips any immediate reactions that James could have, such as desperation on to get help for Davis or denial about the fact that his best friend has just been fatally wounded, and goes straight for a chain of thoughts that would be more appropriate for someone who has already recovered from the immediate shock of the event. It's very jarring and strange, and it comes across as Onision either not knowing how to write grief or never having experienced grief firsthand. Grief is deeper than sadness, and it's deeper than the angsty, self-pitying string of thoughts that go through James' mind. Again, I understand that not everyone is going to have my exact experiences with grief or traumatic events, and I don't expect them to. What I do expect, though, is for a character who is clearly supposed to be relatable to actually be relatable. Here's where I'm edging into potentially offensive territory, and I apologize in advance. I could understand a little bit better if this was an exploration into the mind of a person with some kind of psychological or emotional disorder. If it were discussed in the story, if the main character had been canonically diagnosed with some kind of condition and the narrative was about him going through his life and coping with that condition, I could understand why the reactions to various events were something I would consider unusual or out of touch. I don't have a psychological condition that prevents me from feeling empathy or interferes with the ways I experience grief, so again, I'm very sorry if I'm completely out of line here, and I'll be happy to be told so. I also just want to say that I don't believe that this narrative is a definitive guide to, or an even remotely accurate depiction of, emotional disorders. Not in the slightest. I think if this was something that Onision was trying to pull off, and I'm almost certain it wasn't something that even crossed his mind, he did it incredibly poorly, and he did it in a way that discourages, rather than encourages sympathy and understanding. This is just an alternate way of writing James' story that I believe could be of actual literary merit if done well, which it wouldn't have been if Onision had done it, given what he seems to think of mentally ill people. If you're going to experience this book, I recommend that you listen to people reading this book, rather than read it yourself. The commentary is almost bound to be golden. Honestly, I went in thinking this cold being good, but close to halfway through, it's cringe-worthy self-indulgence. This story is based on the author's life. Onision crafts a world of loathing and self-pity, and lives in it through James, our angsty protagonist. James has fallen for Abbigale, a girl in his class, and spends the novel trying to pander to her. My primary criticism is how unreadable this feels. The pages just drag on and on concerning useless details and pretentious word choice. I'd also like to add the book is full of typos and mistakes like not making a new paragraph for speakers in a dialogue, but that's more of a nitpicky thing. There is little redeemable about any character as they are all just plain awful. I've never read a book that is a trifecta of bad characters, bad writing, and self-indulgence. It's like The Room, but in book form. Avoid at all costs. This audio file was created by Panoprota Basic. You can download it at www.panopreter.com. This book is the epitome of the word awful. Considering how short it is, it's quite astounding how it manages to be problematic in almost every way. The narrator, James, is a self-obsessed sanctimonious misogynist who is essentially a predator. The fact the narrator is supposed to be a better version of the author says a lot about Onisions/Greg. Every other character in the book is empty. Abbigale is flat and emotionless, which just makes his obsession with her seem even creepier. Plus the narrator's supposed best friend serves only as an ego boost to James. To make it worse, it is also one of the most poorly constructed novels I've ever read. The grammar is an absolute mess for a start. Missing words, added words, made up words, misuse of punctuation. Pretty much every mistake which could be made can be found somewhere in Stones to Abbigale. There is literally no plot. It is a stream of random events smashed together with no purpose other than to further the misery of James and Abbigale. This entire book is essentially one massive, and poorly written, pity party. Don't waste your money or your time. If you made it this far, you owe it to yourself to subscribe.